Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to the Teach and Train Women team for the invitation to come along and share some thoughts about worldviews, and in particular about the Christian worldview. First, I should introduce myself. My name's Sheryl. I'm married to Steve. We attend church at Ashfield Presbyterian. We have 2 adult daughters and a son-in-law, and we have a brand new baby granddaughter. I've worked for the Presbyterian Church for more than 8 years now in 2 different jobs that have often overlapped in terms of thinking about how to apply the Bible to ethical questions. In 2013, I began work as the researcher and writer for the Gospel Society and Culture Committee in New South Wales. But I finished up there with that team a couple of months ago in order to spend more time with family. In 2015, I took on the role of the Director's Assistant at APWM, Australian Presbyterian World Mission. I studied at Christ College here in Sydney, finishing my MDiv just before starting work with APWM. So today's talk will bring together some thoughts and ideas that I've developed through my studies and through my work, and I hope they'll be useful to you in your Christian walk and Christian ministry. Here's the plan for the talk. We have 45 minutes ahead of us, so I've divided the talk into 2 parts with a 5-minute break in the middle where we can stretch our legs, make a cup of tea, think about a reflection activity. The first part will help us understand something about worldviews in general, and the second will look more closely at a Christian worldview. And I'm aiming to show there why that offers a better explanation about why the world is the way it is, how a Christian worldview helps us navigate life, and also why it can be difficult for unbelievers to not hear the gospel when we share it with them. I'm hoping the talks will help you perhaps recognise the worldviews or some of the worldviews that might be held by your friends and family, or that you might see in the world around you, so that you can seize every opportunity to enter into gospel conversations. Let's get started. So what do we mean by the term worldview? Well, it is a slippery concept. In the introduction to one of my textbooks, the writer says, "Of the writing of books about worldview, there is no end." Many philosophers and theologians have come up with slightly different definitions, but one of the most helpful I've found is this. A worldview is a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart that can be expressed as a story or in a set of presuppositions which we hold about the basic constitution of reality, what really is, and that provides the foundation on which we live and move and have our being. Now, that definition was suggested by James Sire in his book, The Universe Next Door, which was written in 1976, but is still in print and available at most Christian bookstores. Let's read that again. A worldview is a commitment, a fundamental orientation of the heart that can be expressed as a story or in a set of presuppositions which we hold about the basic constitution of reality, and that provides the foundation on which we live and move and have our being. A good way to summarise this would be to say that a worldview encompasses everything a person believes about the world and how those beliefs shape how he or she lives, or perhaps what we believe about the world and what we need to do, or what we think we need to do in order to live the good life while we're in it. Our beliefs about the world and the way it works will shape our thoughts and actions. They are, to quote James Sire again, the fundamental perspective from which one addresses every area of life. Now, our beliefs about the world around us are an orientation of the heart, and that addresses the 3 basic relationships for human beings: our relationship to God, our relationship to other people, and our relationship to the world around us. Our worldview attempts to make sense of the world. It motivates our behaviour, it provides the moral parameters for our decisions, and it shapes the cultural activities in which we engage. Worldviews are not just the subject of academic discussion because they affect everything about our culture. They affect what we think and what we do in work. They affect what we think about marriage and family. They affect how we engage with scientific and technological pursuits. They shape our politics and our judicial system. They influence our education processes. They shape our arts and entertainment, and they even influence the way we pursue our leisure and recreation. They tell us what we need to do in order to live the good life. Now, these underlying beliefs that we hold about the world might be true or might be only partly true, or they could be entirely false. They might be held consciously or unconsciously. They might be consistent and logical or entirely inconsistent and totally illogical. But here's the thing. A worldview that's false, illogical, and that maybe we don't even realize we hold has as much power to shape our actions and our thoughts as one that is true, logical, consistently thought through, and clearly articulated. Worldviews abound. They're influenced by our history, both personal and cultural, our nationality, our race, our politics, the era in which we live, and even our climate. You might say that there are as many worldviews as there are people in the world. But it is possible to put worldviews into broad categories of beliefs that are held by groups of people, and this helps us understand and engage with them. So, for example, if we were doing a comparative study of religions at school or university, we might look at worldviews on the basis of the religious framework. So we could, for example, talk about Islam and learn that it's a religious worldview where life is shaped by the 5 pillars of Islamic practice: faith, prayer, fasting, almsgiving, and pilgrimage. We could say that Buddhism offers 3 universal truths about the world that shape life as a pursuit of enlightenment through moral conduct and meditation and discernment or wisdom. And that one of those universal truths is karma, the law of cause and effect. We would recognize Hinduism as multifaceted, but we might characterize it in general by the goal of human beings becoming one with ultimate reality, the eternal and universal spirit. And that would be done through religious and ethical disciplines that transform human consciousness. Now, religious frameworks provide us with a useful way of thinking about worldviews. Knowing the basics about the religious beliefs held by our friends and neighbours will help us understand why they, like Christians, are seeking the good life, but they're going about it in a different way. And knowing this might help us find a point of contact for a conversation about Jesus, even if it's only in discussing the differences. On the other hand, if we were philosophers, we might think about worldviews, particularly Western worldviews, on the basis of their philosophical framework. Now, this resource, which is in your resource pack for the conference, uses the images in the same style as the 2 ways to live evangelism resource. So it's really clear to see exactly what the worldview is trying to say about God and the world and human beings. So we might talk about deism, for example, which places the creator God outside the universe, having no personal or loving relationship with anything that he's created. Something like the watchmaker who makes a watch, winds it up, and lets it wind down. Or naturalism, which says that matter, the physical world, is all there is, and there is no God. Nihilism, which negates everything about the world and portrays life as totally meaningless. You could also describe it as nothingism. Or humanism, which places man at the centre of the universe, entirely responsible for everything that happens in it and able to correct all the problems of the world. Existentialism, which attempts to transcend or to correct the course of nihilism by saying that matter does exist, but it's all there is, and human existence is the thing that matters most. Basically, human beings can make themselves into whoever they want to be, and maybe you've heard this articulated as be true to yourself. And we could add to this list the syncretistic and eclectic range of practices and beliefs that some would describe as New Age philosophies, all of which deny the existence of a transcendent God, and all of which put human beings at the centre of reality. Or in other words, I am God, and so are you. Now, very few of our friends would introduce themselves by saying, I'm a deist or I'm an existentialist, in the same way someone might say, I'm a Muslim or I'm a Buddhist. And it would be quite wrong of us to pigeonhole or label people. But still, these philosophical frameworks can help us think about why people think and act the way they do. Now, if we were thinking about how worldviews shape culture, we could add a few more, like those described by Steve Wilkins and Mark Sanford in their book, Hidden Worldviews. Now, these hidden worldviews include individualism, I am the center of the universe; consumerism, I am what I own. There's a great book of essays by seminary students edited by Kevin Van Hooser. The book's called Everyday Theology. And in it, there's an essay describing this worldview as the gospel according to Safeway. In Australia, we might substitute Coles or Woolworths. And it's a worldview where beliefs about the world are shaped by the magazines and impulse items in the checkout aisle at the supermarket. And people respond by trying to live as if they can buy the good life out of their fortnightly pay packet. We could think about nationalism, where my country is God's country and no other country could possibly take this place. Or moral relativism, which says that ethics are shaped by your context and there are no absolutes for right and wrong. Or postmodern tribalism, my tribe, my worldview. This is a worldview in which human identity is anchored in ethnicity or gender or sexual orientation, political persuasion, or some other human characteristic or choice, rather than in basic humanity. And we could add salvation by therapy, where physical therapy and psychological therapy, things like gym memberships, running shoes, medical treatment, and so on, which are good things in themselves, become viewed as a framework for pursuing the good life. Now, in the context of cross-cultural mission, whether it's overseas or here in Australia, we're pushed to look for descriptions or frameworks for the way different cultures respond to the reality of sin in the world. People who study mission often think about three broad worldview paradigms: fear, power; shame, honour; guilt, innocence. And there's one more we'll add at the end. In cultures where there's a fear, power paradigm, people are afraid of being harmed by evil spirits, and they try to gain power over the spirit world through magical rituals. They believe that power overcomes fear, and they live accordingly. And this is something we would expect to see in tribal cultures, in perhaps animistic contexts, for example, in parts of Africa and in parts of Pacifica. But we might also see it in Australia, in communities of people who have come from those countries. In cultures where there's a shame-honour paradigm, people experience shame for not fulfilling the expectations of their family or of their community, and they look for ways to restore that honour or save face. So the goal is to gain honour and avoid shame. Now, we'd expect to see this paradigm operating in collectivist cultures, family-oriented cultures, common in the East, but also in parts of the Pacific. And in cultures where there's a guilt-innocence paradigm, people feel a responsibility to obey the laws of the community, and they see lawbreakers as guilty before the community. Wrongs are rectified not by restoring innocence, because the law can't be unbroken, but by seeking justice or recompense or forgiveness. You'll probably recognise this as the prevailing worldview in Western individualistic cultures, and even as the basis for the legal system of countries like Australia. Living the good life means doing what it takes to maintain your innocence and avoid guilt. Now, in recent years, there's been some helpful cultural analysis done by David Williams, who works with CMS in Melbourne, training missionaries for cross-cultural service in Australia and overseas. His thesis is this: Western cultures, like Australia, are moving away from the guilt-innocence paradigm, and people living in those cultures are now much more likely to make their "how shall I live" type decisions according to a new worldview, which he calls the pain-pleasure paradigm. People who hold this worldview, even if it's unconsciously, seek the good life by trying to live in such a way that they avoid experiencing pain and seek maximum pleasure. Now, we'll come back to a definition or a framework for a well-formed Christian worldview in the second part of this talk. But for now, I just want you to see how Christianity is at odds with all of these worldviews. See, we can't assume that our neighbours will find it easy to hear the gospel message about forgiveness of sin if they see the problems in their life as being caused by evil spirits, which they might do if they've grown up in a culture with the fear, shame paradigm. Or they might have difficulty hearing the gospel about the forgiveness of sin if they see the problems of the world and themselves as coming out of failing to meet community expectations, which they might do if they've grown up in a shame-honour culture. And people who live with a pain-pleasure worldview will not have God and his word as the reference point for their life decisions. And that's certainly what we see as happening in the wider culture in Australia. God is no longer the reference point for our society's moral discourse, our conversations in the public square, the way news is reported, the storylines of TV series, the lyrics of songs, legislation made by governments, and more. Instead, the reference point is what brings us pleasure and what avoids pain. And if you listen carefully to some of the conversations about public square matters in recent months and coming up in the future about, say, euthanasia, which I think Deb's going to talk about, the reference point is about what brings pleasure and minimises pain. And that's because the pain-pleasure worldview, a belief in God is optional. And this is a worldview that says it's okay for you to believe in God if it makes you happy. It's also okay for me not to believe. And the result of this is that God is excluded from the ordinary lives of most people. Individuals locate their identity and their meaning in the self, in the mind, rather than in objective reality. Personal happiness is the greatest good one can pursue. And the community makes decisions about how to live based on what can bring the greatest good or minimise pain for the greatest number of people. Now, to a secular culture, the idea that God has a place in our community or personal lives is totally alien. And that's why people find it difficult to hear the gospel message about Jesus. But the gospel does answer the errors and false promises of all of those worldviews. And we'll come back to that in the second part of the talk.